The harsh morning sun beat down on the four women as they stood on the auction block, their wrists bound with rough rope that cut into their skin. Dust swirled around their ankles as the crowd of miners, cowboys, and townsfolk gathered in the main square of White Oaks, New Mexico territory. The year was 1879, and the frontier town was booming with the recent gold discoveries that had drawn fortune seekers from across the country. Delia Adams kept her head high, despite the humiliation burning her cheeks. At 22, she'd never imagined ending up here, being sold like cattle after the stagecoach robbery that had left her penniless, and at the mercy of this cruel territory. Beside her stood three other women. Mary Thornton, a schoolteacher from Boston who'd come west for a teaching position that had fallen through. Catherine Wilson, a widow whose husband had died of fever on their journey west. And Sarah Blackwell, barely 18, who'd been traveling to meet her uncle when disaster struck. Next up, four fine women suitable for cooking, cleaning, and other domestic duties, called the auctioneer, a man with yellowed teeth and alcohol on his breath. Sold as a group to the highest bidder. Delia's stomach churned as men in the crowd jeered and called out crude suggestions. She glanced at the other women, Mary's face pale with shock, Catherine silently weeping, young Sarah trembling visibly. $500, called a voice from the crowd. The crowd parted to reveal Edgar Winters, the owner of the largest mining operation in the territory. A man known for his cruelty toward his workers and his insatiable greed. His cold eyes swept over the women like they were nothing more than tools to be used. "These ladies will make fine additions to my establishment," Winters said, his voice carrying across the square. "My miners need companionship." Delia's blood ran cold. She'd heard stories about the women who ended up in Winters' mining camp. None of them ended well, 500 going once. The auctioneer began, "I offer something else." A deep voice cut through the murmurs of the crowd. All heads turned to see a tall man on horseback at the edge of the gathering. The sun silhouetted his broad shoulders, and as he nudged his horse forward, Delia could make out his features' strong jaw, eyes the color of a summer storm, and sun-bronzed skin that spoke of years under the open sky. "Preston James," someone in the crowd muttered, and the name rippled through the onlookers. Winters' face darkened. "This is no concern of yours, Cowboy." Preston dismounted in one fluid motion, his spurs jangling as his boots hit the dirt. He moved with the easy confidence of a man who knew the land in his own mind. "I'm making it my concern," he said, his voice level but carrying authority that made even the auctioneer pause. "I'm offering my land, the north parcel. 200 acres of good grazing land with a creek running through it." Gasps rose from the crowd. Everyone knew that land, prime property that many had tried to buy from Preston over the years. "Land for women," Winters scoffed, but there was a calculating gleam in his eyes. "Land that borders your mining claim," Preston clarified. "Land you've been trying to get your hands on for 3 years. Delia watched the exchange with growing hope. This stranger was offering something valuable, something that might save them from a fate worse than death. Winters stroked his beard, considering. "How do I know it's a fair trade?" "You know exactly what that land is worth," Preston replied. "More than you're offering for these women. The deed is in my saddlebag. We can make the exchange right now at the county office." The tension in the square was palpable as Winters weighed his options. Finally, a greedy smile spread across his face. "Deal," he said, extending his hand. "But I want those papers signed before these women go anywhere." An hour later, after the legal formalities had been completed at the county office, Preston led the 4 women away from town. They walked in silence, following his horse until they reached a small creek several miles outside White Oaks. "You can wash up here," he said, cutting their bonds with a knife. "You're free now." "Free?" Mary asked, rubbing her wrists. "What do you mean?" "I mean you don't belong to anyone," Preston said simply. "Not to Winters, not to me. You're free women." "But your land," Catherine said. "You gave up your land for strangers." A shadow passed over Preston's face. "Some things matter more than land." "Why?" Delia asked, meeting his gaze directly for the first time. "Why would you do that for us?" Preston was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the landscape. "My sister," he finally said. 3 years ago, she ended up in Winter's mining camp. She didn't survive a month." He turned back to them, his jaw tight. "I couldn't stand by and watch it happen again." Something passed between Delia and Preston in that moment, understanding, gratitude, and something deeper that neither was ready to name. "What will you do now?" Sarah asked, her voice small. Preston shouldered his rifle. "I still have my ranch. Smaller now, but enough. You're welcome to stay there until you decide what's next. There's a cabin where you'll have privacy." "And what do you expect in return?" Delia asked, wariness in her voice. "Nothing," Preston said firmly. "Though if you're willing to help with cooking and such while you're there, I wouldn't turn it down. Been living on my own cooking too long." The hint of a smile softened his features. As the 5 of them made their way toward Preston's ranch, the weight of what had happened and what might have happened settled over Delia. They had been saved from a terrible fate, but what lay ahead was uncertain. One thing was clear, though. The quiet cowboy leading them through the New Mexico wilderness had given up something precious to set them free, and that wasn't a debt easily repaid. The James Ranch sprawled across a rolling valley, modest compared to some but clearly built with care. A one-story ranch house stood surrounded by several outbuildings, a corral with a few horses, and a small herd of cattle grazing in the distance. The promised cabin sat about 100 yards from the main house, simple but solid. "It's not much," Preston said as they approached, "but it's dry and there's a stove." "It's perfect," Mary said, relief evident in her voice. The cabin had 2 rooms, a main living area with a stove and table, and a bedroom with 2 beds. It would be cramped for 4 women, but after what they'd nearly faced, none complained. Preston brought them supplies, food, blankets, and clean clothing that had belonged to his late mother and sister. "I'll leave you to settle in," he said. "Come to the main house when you're ready for supper." After he left, the women finally had a moment to process everything that had happened. "I can't believe he gave up his land for us," Catherine said, shaking her head. "Land is everything out here." "Men like him are rare," Mary agreed, arranging blankets on one of the beds. Delia stood by the window watching Preston's retreating figure. "I wonder what he's not telling us." "Does it matter?" Sarah asked. "He saved us." "Everything matters out here," Delia replied softly. "Everything has a price." That evening they gathered in Preston's kitchen. The house was simple but well-maintained, with sturdy furniture and a few touches handmade quilts. Books on shelves that spoke of a home rather than just a place to sleep. Preston proved to be a surprisingly decent cook, serving up a hearty stew with fresh bread. As they ate, the women shared their stories, how they'd all ended up on that auction block. Mary had come west for a teaching position in Santa Fe, only to discover the school had hired someone else. With her money running low, she decided to try her luck in the mining towns. Catherine had been traveling west with her husband when fever took him. Alone and grief-stricken, she'd continued the journey, hoping to reach her cousin in California. Sarah, the youngest, had been sent to live with her uncle after her parents died, only to discover upon arrival that he'd moved on, leaving no forwarding address. Delia's story was different. "I came west by choice," she explained. My father wanted me to marry a man 3 times my age back in Pennsylvania. I refused, so I took what money I had and headed west. I was planning to start a dressmaking business. What happened? Preston asked, his first real question of the evening. The stagecoach was robbed 3 days out of White Oaks, Delia said. They took everything, money, clothes, even my sewing kit. The driver was killed and we were left stranded. A group of men found us and brought us to town, but instead of helping us. She trailed off, the rest of the story clear to everyone. Preston's jaw tightened. The law in these parts has a way of looking the other way when it's convenient. And now, Mary asked, what happens to us now? Preston leaned back in his chair. That's for you to decide. You can stay here until you figure it out. There's work on the ranch if you want it, paid fair, or I can arrange passage to wherever you want to go when the next wagon train passes through. Why would you do all this? Delia asked. The land was enough. You don't owe us anything more. Preston met her gaze steadily. Maybe I'm tired of watching this territory destroy decent people. Later that night, as the women settled into their cramped quarters, Delia lay awake, thinking about the cowboy in the house across the yard. There was more to Preston James than he was letting on, pain behind his eyes that went deeper than the loss of his sister. But there was also strength there, and decency that seemed rare in this harsh land. What do you make of him? Catherine whispered in the darkness. I don't know, Delia admitted, but I think we're lucky he was there today. He looks at you differently, Catherine observed, when he thinks no one notices. Delia felt her cheeks warm. Don't be ridiculous, he's just being decent. But as she drifted off to sleep, Delia couldn't help wondering about the man who had given up his land for strangers, and whether Catherine might be right about the way he looked at her. The next morning brought a new reality. Preston was up before dawn, and by the time the women emerged from the cabin, he had already tended to the horses and was mending a fence near the corral. Good morning, Delia called, approaching him with a cup of coffee she'd brewed in their cabin. Preston looked up, surprise flickering across his features before he schooled them into his usual calm expression. Morning, he replied, accepting the coffee with a nod of thanks. I thought you might need this, she said, and I wanted to ask about work. You mentioned there might be some. Preston took a sip of the coffee, regarding her over the rim of the cup. You serious about working? All of us are, Delia said firmly. We discussed it last night. We won't be charity cases. A hint of respect showed in Preston's eyes. Fair enough. There's plenty to do around here. Can any of you cook? Catherine's an excellent cook. Mary was a school teacher. She's good with figures and could help with your accounts. Sarah's young but strong and willing to learn anything. And I can sew. I noticed some of your shirts could use mending. Preston glanced down at his worn shirt and actually smiled, a brief flash that transformed his face. Reckon you're right about that. They worked out an arrangement, fair pay for fair work, with the women helping around the ranch while they decided on their next steps. Preston proved to be a decent employer, demanding but reasonable, and never treating them with anything less than respect. Days stretched into weeks, and a routine developed. The women took over the cooking and housekeeping, freeing Preston to focus on the ranch work. Sarah, surprisingly, showed an aptitude for working with the horses and spent much of her time helping Preston in the corral. Mary took over the ranch accounts, discovering years of neglected paperwork that she sorted with efficient precision. Catherine's cooking transformed meals from basic sustenance to something worth looking forward to. And Delia found herself spending more time with Preston than she'd anticipated. It started with mending his clothes, but soon she was helping him with other tasks, learning about ranch life and the territory from a man who clearly knew both well. One evening, about a month after their arrival, Preston found Delia sitting alone on the porch of the cabin. staring at the sunset. "Mind some company?" he asked, hesitating at the bottom step. Delia shifted over, making room for him on the bench. "Not at all." They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the sky transform into brilliant oranges and purples. "I've been meaning to ask," Delia finally said. "How long have you been out here?" Preston leaned back, stretching his long legs out before him. "Came west with my parents when I was 12. That was 1861. They were looking to escape the war brewing back east. My pa built this place from nothing." Pride and sadness mingled in his voice. "Lost him to a fever 5 years later. Ma and my sister Rebecca stayed on and we kept the ranch going. And your mother passed 3 winters ago, same year as Becca." His jaw tightened. "Been just me since then." Delia felt the weight of his loneliness. "I'm sorry." Preston shrugged, but the gesture couldn't disguise the pain in his eyes. "That's life out here. Beautiful but harsh." "Like you," Delia said softly, then flushed when she realized she'd spoken aloud. Preston looked at her sharply, surprise evident in his expression before it softened into something warmer. "Most would just say harsh." "Most people don't look closely enough," Delia replied, holding his gaze. Something shifted between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of the growing connection that neither had been ready to name. Preston cleared his throat. "I've been meaning to tell you there's a wagon train coming through next week, heading to California. If any of you want to move on, this would be the time." The news settled heavily in Delia's chest. "I see. You don't have to decide now," Preston added quickly. "Just wanted you to know." That night, the 4 women sat around their cabin discussing their options. "I think I'll go," Catherine said quietly. "My cousin's still in California. She's all the family I have left." Mary nodded. "I've saved enough to make a fresh start. There are schools in California that might need teachers." All eyes turned to Sarah, who twisted her hands in her lap. "I don't want to go," she admitted. "I like it here. I like working with the horses. Mr. James said I have a gift for it." "And you, Delia?" Mary asked. Delia stared into the fire. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I came west to make my own way, not to depend on someone else." "Is that really what's happening here?" Catherine asked gently. "Or are you finding a new path?" Delia had no answer, but that night she dreamed of Preston, of his hands, strong and sure, of his eyes seeing her in a way no one ever had before, of a future she hadn't dared imagine. The next day she found Preston in the barn, repairing a saddle. He looked up when she entered, his expression carefully neutral. "Catherine and Mary have decided to join the wagon train," she told him without preamble. Preston nodded slowly. "And you and Sarah?" "Sarah wants to stay." "She says you told her she has a gift with horses." "She does," Preston confirmed. "Best natural hand with them I've seen in years." Delia took a deep breath. "If she stays, she'll need looking after. She's young." "I'd treat her like family," Preston promised. "Make sure she learns what she needs to make her own way." "And me?" Delia asked, her heart pounding. "If I stayed," Preston set aside the saddle and stood, crossing the distance between them. "What do you want, Delia?" The directness of his question took her breath away. "I want—" she began, then faltered. "I don't want to be owned, not by anyone, not even by kindness or obligation." Understanding dawned in Preston's eyes. "Is that what you think this is? Obligation, isn't it? You saved us, you gave up your land." "I gave up land," Preston corrected. "Just dirt and rocks. Valuable, sure, but still just land." He took another step closer. "What's growing between us, that's something else entirely. At least it is for me." Delia's breath caught. "And what is that exactly?" Preston reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "Something I never expected to find. Something worth more than any piece of land." The day the wagon train arrived brought mixed emotions. Catherine and Mary packed their few belongings, ready to continue their journey west. Tearful goodbyes were exchanged at the edge of Preston's property, where the wagon master had agreed to meet them. "Right when you're settled," Delia said, embracing first Mary, then Catherine. "Let us know you're safe." "Take care of Sarah," Catherine replied. "And don't be afraid of happiness, Delia. You deserve it." As they watched the wagons disappear into the distance, Preston stood beside Delia, not touching but close enough that she could feel his presence solid and reassuring. "They'll be all right," he said quietly. "I know," Delia replied. "They're strong women." They turned back toward the ranch, toward what was becoming home. Sarah had already returned to the corral, eager to continue working with a young colt she'd been training. "What about you?" Preston asked as they walked. "Any regrets about staying?" Delia considered the question seriously. "No," she finally said. "No regrets. But I meant what I said before. I need to make my own way. I can't just be kept." Preston stopped walking and turned to face her. "I've been thinking about that. The town's growing. Folks there need someone who can sew proper clothing, not just make do with catalog orders." Delia's eyes widened. "Are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting you start that dressmaking business you came west for," Preston said. "There's a small building on the edge of town that's standing empty. Used to be the assayer's office before he moved to a bigger place. I know the owner. He'd rent it to you fair. But I don't have money for rent or supplies or—" "I do," Preston interrupted. "Call it an investment, not charity. You pay me back when you can." Delia stared at him, emotions warring within her. "Why would you do that?" Preston's gaze softened. "Because I see you, Delia Adams. You're not someone to be kept or owned. You're someone to be admired from up close if you'll allow it." 2 months later, Delia's dressmaking shop opened in White Oaks. It was small but tidy, with a large window displaying her work and letting in natural light for sewing. Word spread quickly, and within weeks, she had more orders than she could handle alone. Preston helped her move into a small apartment above the shop, carrying furniture and installing shelves with the same care he showed in everything he did. Sarah split her time between helping at the ranch and helping at the shop, learning both trades with enthusiasm. The arrangement worked well. Delia maintained her independence while building something of her own, and her friendship with Preston deepened into something more deliberate and tender. He would ride into town 2 or 3 times a week, sometimes on business, sometimes just to bring her wildflowers or invite her to dinner. Their first kiss came on a warm summer evening as Preston walked her home after a town social. It was gentle and questioning at first, then deepened into something that left them both breathless. "I've wanted to do that for a long time," Preston admitted, his forehead resting against hers. "What took you so long, Cowboy?" Delia teased, her hands still resting on his chest. "Wanted to make sure you knew it was your choice," he replied seriously. "That you weren't beholden." The words touched her deeply. "I'm not beholden," she assured him. "I'm choosing you because of who you are, not what you did for me." As summer turned to fall, their relationship blossomed. Delia's business thrived, allowing her to repay Preston's investment faster than either had expected. Sarah, now 19, had become an accomplished horsewoman and was beginning to make a name for herself breaking horses for other ranchers in the area. But trouble was brewing. Edgar Winters had not forgotten Preston's interference, nor had he given up his predatory ways. Reports reached them of other women being brought to the mining camp under dubious circumstances, and Preston's jaw would tighten with barely suppressed anger whenever Winters' name was mentioned. The confrontation came on a crisp October day. Delia was working in her shop when the bell over the door jangled, announcing a customer. She looked up with a smile that quickly faded when she saw Edgar Winters standing there, flanked by 2 of his men. Miss Adams, he said, removing his hat with mock politeness. Quite a little business you've built here. Delia set down her sewing carefully. Mr. Winters, what can I do for you? I find myself in need of some special garments for some special ladies at my camp. His smile was oily. I hear you're the best seamstress in the territory. Delia's stomach churned, but she kept her expression neutral. I'm afraid my schedule is full at the moment. Perhaps you could try Santa Fe. Winter's smile didn't falter, but his eyes hardened. I don't think you understand. I'm not asking. One of his men moved to lock the shop door while the other pulled down the shade. Delia's heart pounded as she realized she was trapped. You've been a problem for me, Miss Adams, Winters continued, all pretense of politeness gone. You and your cowboy. That land he gave me turned out to be less valuable than promised. No water rights. His face twisted with anger. He cheated me. Preston James doesn't cheat, Delia said firmly, though fear coursed through her. If you didn't check the deed properly, that's your failing. Winters moved closer, his bulk intimidating in the small shop. I think it's time you and I came to an understanding. You'll be coming with me to the mining camp. Your skills are needed there. I'm not going anywhere with you, Delia said, reaching beneath her cutting table for the small revolver Preston had insisted she keep there. Before she could grasp it, the shop door burst open, splintering the lock. Preston stood in the doorway, his expression thunderous, with Sarah right behind him. Get away from her, Winters, he said, his voice deadly calm. Winters' men reached for their guns, but Preston was faster, his revolver already drawn. I wouldn't, he advised them. Miss Reynolds here is quite handy with a shotgun, and she's aiming right at your backs. Sarah stood just outside the door, the mentioned shotgun steady in her hands. Winters raised his hand slowly. Now, James, this is just a misunderstanding between me and the lady. There's no misunderstanding, Preston said. You're trespassing and threatening, that's clear enough. You cost me good money with that land deal, Winters spat. Land without water rights practically worthless. The deed was clear, Preston replied. Not my fault if you were too greedy to read it properly before signing. Winters' face mottled with rage. You set me up. I protected those women from a predator, Preston corrected. Now you're going to turn around and walk out of here. And if you ever come near Miss Adams, Miss Reynolds, or any other woman in this town again, I'll make sure the territorial marshal hears about what really goes on at your mining camp. The standoff stretched for several tense seconds before Winters finally backed down. This isn't over, James, he warned as he and his men moved toward the door. Yes, it is, Preston replied. Unless you want it to end much worse for you. After they left, Preston crossed quickly to Delia, his hands gentle as they cupped her face. Are you all right? Did they hurt you? I'm fine, she assured him, though she couldn't stop trembling. How did you know? Sarah saw them heading this way, Preston explained. She rode to the ranch to get me. Sarah stepped inside, still holding the shotgun. I don't think they'll be back soon, but maybe we should post a guard for a few days. Preston nodded. I'll speak to the sheriff. Winters has friends there, but not everyone in town is in his pocket. That night, Preston stayed in town, sleeping on a cot in the back room of Delia's shop while Sarah took the small apartment upstairs. None of them voiced the fear that Winters might return, but it hung in the air between them. Unable to sleep, Delia joined Preston in the back room, sitting beside his cot in the darkness. I keep thinking about what might have happened if you hadn't arrived when you did, she admitted. Preston reached for her hand. But we did arrive. This time, Delia said softly. But Winters won't give up, will he? And there are other women who don't have someone to protect them. Preston was quiet for a long moment. I've been thinking about that, he finally said. Winters has powerful friends, but he also has enemies. People who have lost family to his mines, or had their land taken through dubious means. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting it's time someone stood up to him, not just for you, or for the memory of my sister, but for everyone in this territory he's hurt. There was determination in Preston's voice that both frightened and reassured Delia. That sounds dangerous, she said, squeezing his hand. Living is dangerous, Preston replied simply. Especially out here, but that doesn't mean we stop trying to make things better. The next day, Preston met with several men in town: ranchers, shopkeepers, and miners who had grievances against Winters. Sarah, showing leadership skills no one had suspected, organized a meeting of the town's women to discuss the ongoing threat to their safety. Over the following weeks, evidence was gathered: testimonies from women who had escaped the mining camp, documentation of Winters' fraudulent business practices, witnesses to his intimidation tactics. The territorial marshal, when presented with the evidence, couldn't ignore it any longer. The day Winters was arrested was a turning point for White Oaks. The town seemed to collectively exhale, as if a dark cloud had been lifted. His mining operation, built on exploitation and cruelty, began to crumble as workers abandoned it for fairer employment elsewhere. For Delia, the arrest brought both relief and reflection. One evening, as she and Preston walked along the creek on his property, their favorite place for private conversations, she shared her thoughts. "I've been thinking about Catherine and Mary," she said. "About their journey west and mine." "Do you regret not going with them?" Preston asked, a hint of uncertainty in his voice. "No," Delia said firmly, "but I've been thinking about journeys and how sometimes the destination isn't what you expected." Preston stopped walking and turned to face her. "And what about your journey? Where do you see it leading?" Delia looked up at him, this man who had given up his land to save strangers, who had helped her build a business and her own independence, who had stood beside her rather than in front of her. "I came west looking for freedom," she said softly. "And I found it, but not in the way I expected. I found it in a place where I could be myself, where I could build something of my own. And I found it with someone who understands that my independence doesn't threaten his." Preston's eyes were bright in the fading light. "Is that your roundabout way of saying you might consider staying permanently?" Delia smiled. "Are you asking me something, Preston James?" Preston took her hands in his expression suddenly serious. "I had a speech planned. Was going to do this properly next week with a ring and everything." Delia's breath caught. "And now I'm thinking life's too unpredictable to wait for the perfect moment." He dropped to one knee, still holding her hands. "Delia Adams, I love you. I love your strength and your determination. I love how you faced the worst this territory could throw at you and still found the courage to build something beautiful. I don't want to own you or keep you. I want to stand beside you for as long as you'll have me. Will you marry me?" Tears blurred Delia's vision. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." Their wedding, held the following spring, was a celebration that brought together the entire town. Sarah stood as Delia's maid of honor, proudly wearing a dress she had helped Delia design. Letters from Catherine and Mary arrived just in time, sharing their well wishes and news of their successful new lives in California. The ceremony was simple but meaningful, held outdoors beside the creek where Preston had first cut their bonds and set them free. As they exchanged vows, Delia thought about the journey that had brought her here, the fear and uncertainty, but also the unexpected joy and love she had found. "I, Preston James, take you, Delia Adams, to be my lawfully wedded wife," Preston said, his voice steady and sure. "I promise to stand beside you, not above you, to support your dreams as my own, to love you freely as you deserve to be loved." Delia's voice trembled slightly as she repeated her own vows, adding, I promise to build a life with you that honors both our strengths. To face whatever comes our way together. To love you honestly and completely, today and all our days. Their life together began in earnest that day, not as a culmination of their journey, but as the start of a new one. Preston expanded the ranch house, adding rooms for the family they hoped to have, while Delia's business continued to grow. She took on an apprentice, a young woman from town who showed promise with a needle, allowing Delia to split her time between the shop and the ranch. Sarah, now considered family by both Preston and Delia, thrived in her role at the ranch. Her skill with horses had become legendary in the territory, and ranchers regularly brought their most difficult animals for her to train. She lived in the cabin that had once housed all 4 women, making it her own with small touches that reflected her growing confidence and independence. The years that followed brought both challenges and joys. Winter's arrest had weakened his influence, but his allies still caused trouble from time to time. The territory itself posed constant challenges: drought one year, floods the next, and the ever-present danger of outlaws and claim jumpers. But there were joys too: the birth of their first child, a son they named Michael, after Preston's father. 2 years later came a daughter, Rebecca, named for Preston's sister. The children grew up strong and free, learning both the gentle arts from their mother and the ways of the ranch from their father. Letters continued to arrive from Catherine and Mary. Catherine had indeed found her cousin and had opened a boarding house in San Francisco that catered to respectable women traveling alone. Mary had secured a position at a girls' school in Sacramento and was now its headmistress. Their stories, so different from what might have been had Preston not intervened that fateful day, were a constant reminder of how a single act of courage could change many lives. One evening, nearly 10 years after that day on the auction block, Delia found Preston sitting on the porch of their expanded home, watching the sunset. She joined him, settling comfortably into the space beside him that seemed made for her. "Penny for your thoughts," she said, resting her head against his shoulder. Preston's arm came around her, drawing her closer. "Just thinking about land," he said. "The north parcel?" Delia asked. The land he had traded for their freedom had eventually been abandoned when Winter's mining operation collapsed. It had sat empty for years, a silent reminder of what might have been. "Got word today," Preston said. "It's coming up for auction. The territorial government seized it for back taxes." Delia straightened, looking at him closely. "Are you thinking of buying it back?" Preston nodded slowly. "Been saving for it. Thought it might be a good legacy for Michael and Rebecca, and," he hesitated, "thought it might make things come full circle somehow." Understanding dawned in Delia's eyes. The land that bought freedom becoming part of a free family's future. "Something like that," Preston admitted with a small smile. "Too poetic." "Not at all," Delia said, kissing him softly. "I think it's perfect." The day of the auction arrived bright and clear. Preston and Delia rode into town together, their children staying behind with Sarah, who had promised to teach Michael more about working with the new foal. The auction was held in the same square where Delia and the other women had once stood on the block. The irony wasn't lost on either of them as they took their places among the bidders. Several parcels of land were sold before the north parcel came up. When it did, a murmur ran through the crowd. Everyone knew its history and its connection to Preston James. "Next up, 200 acres north of town, formerly part of the Winter's mining claim," the auctioneer announced. "Starting bid of $500. Preston raised his hand, and the bidding began. Several others joined in. Land was always valuable in the territory, but Preston was determined. As the price climbed, bidders dropped out one by one until only Preston and one other man remained. The bid reached $1,500, a substantial sum, and at the upper limit of what Preston had saved. He hesitated, looking at Delia, who nodded encouragement. 1,600, Preston called. The other bidder, a man Preston didn't recognize, studied him for a moment before shaking his head and stepping back. "It's yours," he said, loud enough for Preston to hear. "It should be." Relief and satisfaction mingled on Preston's face as the auctioneer brought down his gavel. "Sold to Preston James for $1,600. As they completed the paperwork in the county office, the same office where Preston had signed away the land a decade before Delia squeezed his hand. "How does it feel?" she asked. Preston considered the question. "Like something that was broken is whole again," he finally said. "Not just the land, but something larger." That evening they rode out to the north parcel together. The land had recovered from the mining operations, grass had reclaimed much of it, and the creek ran clear again. They dismounted near a large oak tree that had somehow survived the years of exploitation. "What will we do with it?" Delia asked, looking out over the rolling landscape. Preston wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "I've been thinking about that. What would you say to building a proper school here? White Oaks is growing. There are more families, more children." Delia turned in his arms, searching his face. "A school," Mary writes about how education changes lives, Preston explained. "And I keep thinking about those women at Winter's mining camp, how many ended up there because they had no other options, no skills that were valued." "A school," Delia repeated, warmth spreading through her chest. "I love that idea." The White Oak School opened 2 years later, a solid building of brick and timber, with large windows and a playground. Mary traveled from California for the opening, bringing with her recommendations for books and teaching materials. The town council, now including both Preston and Delia among its members, hired a young teacher from back east, a woman with progressive ideas about education for both boys and girls. As their family and community grew, Delia often reflected on the strange journey that had brought her west. The terrifying day on the auction block seemed like another lifetime, a dark moment that had ultimately led to light. The trading of land for freedom had been just the beginning of a story that continued to unfold in ways she could never have imagined. On the 15th anniversary of their wedding, Preston surprised Delia with a special gift, a locket containing a tiny fragment of earth. "From the north parcel," he explained as she opened it. A reminder that sometimes what seems like the end of everything is just the beginning of something better. Delia's eyes filled with tears as she closed her hand around the locket. "I never thought I'd be grateful for ending up on that auction block," she said softly. "But without it, I might never have found you, never have found this life." Preston drew her close. "Life has a way of taking us places we never expected," he said. "The trick is finding the courage to make something good out of whatever comes." As they stood together on the porch of their home, watching their children playing with the newest foal under Sarah's watchful eye, Delia knew that courage wasn't something you found once, but something you chose every day, the courage to love, to build, to stand up for what was right. The land that had once been traded for freedom had become the foundation for so much more. A school that would educate generations of children, a ranch that provided not just for their family but for many in the community, a legacy of standing against injustice. And at the heart of it all was the love between a woman who had sought freedom and a cowboy who had understood that the greatest gift he could offer was not protection, but partnership. Their story, beginning in desperation at an auction block and flowering into something rich and enduring, had become part of the fabric of White Oaks itself, a reminder that even in the harsh reality of the West, compassion and courage could change not just individual lives, but the very nature of a community. As the sun set over the New Mexico territory, painting the landscape in gold and purple, Delia leaned into Preston's embrace, grateful for the unexpected journey that had brought her home.